You push open the door in the barracks and you see a dimly lit room. Okay, what else? What does it actually look like? If you're watching this right now, chances are that the dimly lit room that I just described looked completely different in your head than it did to the next 10 people watching this video. The truth is, as DMs, we completely forget that what we see in our heads is not necessarily what our players are seeing at the table. And I think this becomes painfully apparent when your players start to ask you follow-up questions, like asking you to re-describe a scene, or they start to hit you with mechanical follow-up questions like, how high is the ceiling? Or the absolute worst one is, sorry, can you say that again? I totally spaced out. And I think when they're asking you questions like that, or asking you to just completely re-describe something because they weren't paying attention, what's happening is that you're not painting a clear enough picture for them. You're not painting a clear enough picture that is engaging. They spaced out because you're giving them this visual shopping list, asking them to try and visualize something in their head based off of a description. Now, a really good classic example might be something like, you stumble across a castle. Well, that's not much to go off of, right? What kind of castle? How big is the castle? How far away is it? So you might try to fix that and add a couple of standard adjectives, something like, you stumble across a large stone castle. Well, okay, you get a slightly better picture, but the picture itself is still flat. It's still just a blueprint. It's a two-dimensional image that they're seeing in their head, and it could mean a million different things. But watch what happens when we add a single sense, just one sense. Watch what happens and how the brain instantly wakes up. You smell wet earth and moss, and as you turn the corner, you stumble across a large castle at the base of a mountain. Boom. Now we're getting somewhere. Your brain instantly registers dampness, shade, crisp mountain air, maybe some evergreens. And just to show you exactly how powerful that single sense is, let's keep the exact same visual. Let's keep the castle, but let's swap it out with one sense. Let's just swap out the smell. You smell dust and hot sand, and you see a large castle on the horizon. Well, think about that. The castle itself didn't change. We didn't change anything about how we're describing the castle. Only one sense changed, and that one sense completely warped how you visualized the world in front of you. That mountain is gone. The moisture is gone. You were suddenly in an arid desert campaign. So let's take it a step further. Let's layer them. Let's add a little bit of detail to the wording. Well, you smell wet earth and moss, and as you turn the corner, the first thing that you notice is the roaring sound of a rushing river. And then you see a large castle sitting right there at the base of the mountain. Now the environment has volume, right? It has humidity, it has scale. So let's keep going, let's keep trying, let's get the party approaching the fortress now, right? The front gate of the castle is wide open, and as you walk closer, you smell salted meats. You can almost taste the savory grease. Your characters have been traveling for days, surviving on these stale rations, these hard rations, and your stomach immediately starts to growl. Your mouth is actively salivating. Or we can flip it back to our desert castle setup instead. You step out into the hot, blistering sun. You take a breath, and you get this massive whiff of dry dust and sand that instantly cakes the back of your throat. It's almost choking you. But underneath that heat, you can still smell this slightly sweet, salty meat in the air. You follow that scent and you hear the muffled sound of voices growing louder until it turns into the unmistakable roar of a bustling market. Now, do you see how incredibly clear that picture is? Or I guess I should say more clear. You aren't just reading a description anymore because you're actively triggering your players' biology. Their mouths probably started to water. Their throats probably started to feel dry. And they're leaning in because they want to know where that sound is coming from. So why does that happen? Why does a handful of sensory words from across the table completely change a player's physical and mental state? Well, it happens because of this fascinating biological reality. Your brain cannot always tell the difference between a vividly imagined experience and real life. You see, when you feed your players multisensory data, you are actually triggering a neurological phenomenon that's called embodied cognition. Now, this framework is a theory in cognitive science that completely rejects the old idea of the brain acting like an isolated computer program that's locked inside of a bone box. That's a horrifying image. Instead, it proves that human thinking, so memory, emotion, all of these things are fundamentally rooted in our physical bodies and how we navigate the world. And there's some really fascinating examples when you really start to dive into it. So when you use 5 senses at the table, you are connecting 3 major pillars of cognitive science that actually hijacks your players' nervous systems. So, for example, you're bypassing the logical filter in the human brain. So to understand how you hook a player, you have to first understand why scent is the ultimate brain cheat code. You see, when you see a castle or you hear a river, the data has to travel to the brain's central sorting hub, the thalamus. That data has to then be analyzed and translated, and it takes time and it stays abstract in the brain. But olfactory data, meaning data that comes from smell, completely bypasses that. It goes straight to the amygdala, which is the emotional center of the brain, the hippocampus, which is the memory center. And this shortcut is exactly why smells have this unparalleled power that instantly hijacks our brain. It's why a whiff of a specific perfume or old book pages can instantly drag you into a vivid memory from 10 years ago into the present day. And it's why your brain can trick you into experiencing phantom smells when you're thinking about a memory, because the olfactory bulb is physically intertwined with the brain's emotional and memory networks, meaning that a single scent, or a single scent cue, I guess is really what I mean in this instance, like wet earth or hot sand, triggers emotion and it triggers physiology instantly, and it bypasses the logical I'm sitting in a chair rolling plastic dice filter. That scent opens the door for sensory motor simulation. Your brain relies on sensory motor dependence. This principle states that our ability to think, to reason, to understand any concept is deeply rooted in how we physically experience the world, meaning that even abstract concepts like time or danger are processed through our physical history. It's the reason why we say things like moving forward into the future or looking back at the past. We're not actually doing any of that. Our body needs to process things in a way that we are able to understand, using language that we're able to understand. DMs out there, have you ever been running a session and you can literally feel your players getting bored? I know I have. If you have ever felt like your game sessions could use just a little bit more life like me, then give me just a few seconds. Let me show you today's sponsor, Describe. So what is Describe? Well, honestly, I thought a lot about how to describe Describe, pun intended. And it's the difference between reading about a stormy sea and actually feeling it, right? The chill as the thunder rolls and the waves crash, all perfectly timed with your story, all at your fingertips. And it's because Describe isn't just bringing sound, it's literally giving life to your adventures, from a massive array of maps to epic battle sounds and ambience and sound effects and immersive text that's already written for you, all the way to truly beautiful music. Honestly, the music alone should win some awards, and it all just makes your sessions so unforgettable. And the best part is that it's created by players for players, so all it takes is one subscription for the whole table. I promise you, if you are one of those DMs that wants to make that leap to make your table just that much better for your players, check out Describe and bring your next session to life. It's the tool I always wanted whenever I ran a game. I'm super excited that I found it. So click the link in the description, just give it a look. You're already on the internet, just click the thing, take a peek, and if you want to take the dive, create your account and use my code FANTASYFORGE. Functional MRI brain scans, or fMRIs, prove that when a person hears vivid multisensory descriptions, the brain isn't just processing the language, it's actually running micro simulations of that physical experience. So if you describe a throat feeling dry from desert sand, the part of the brain that processes physical sensation fires up exactly as if a real grain of sand had hit that player's throat. Because their abstract reasoning depends on their physical memory, their brain forces them to mentally live the environment just to understand your sentence. And then finally, this full body simulation then triggers a physical reflex. So when you start to tell a starving character that they smell sizzling, savory meat, you're activating the extended mind. Because cognition, or thinking, doesn't stop in the skull. We are constantly using our physiology and our environment to process reality. You can see this in instances when we're like counting on our fingers, we're gesturing to explain a point. We're using our physical body in order to try and say the thing that is in our brain. The moment that a brain processes a survival-related sensory cue like food or heat, it automatically activates the autonomic nervous system. Autonomic? Autonomic. I don't know, I'm not a doctor. I just like researching stuff. It triggers these submandibular glands to flood the mouth with saliva, and it signals the stomach to release digestive acids. It causes your body to make your stomach rumble. Your players aren't role-playing being hungry or uncomfortable. Their physical bodies are actually and actively reacting to the environment that you created, that you stated. It's the same reason why if you've gone a whole day at work at your office and somebody brings up pizza, you suddenly have a craving for pizza. It's because your body is taking in the information that you have given to them and making them want that pizza. It's making them think, well, what does that pizza taste like? What does it look like? What does it smell like? When you rely on basic visual descriptions, you are talking to your players intellect. You're making them do all of that heavy lifting. You're asking them to render the scene in their head, and the second that they get tired, they space out. When you stop describing things and you start to show it to them through those five senses, you're talking directly to their biology. You're taking the burden of imagination off of their shoulders, triggering their physical reflexes and letting their own nervous system do that world building for you. And that's just science and fantasy in one thing. And if you are a fan of this channel, you know that that is 100% what I like to do. So if you're asking me what my advice to you is, you need to learn how to become a better describer. Use as many senses as you can. So if you're describing a castle, talk about how they can feel the cold, damp water on the stone, how the heat of the oppressive sun has gone down several degrees because of the stone here, how the moss is growing on the stones. When they push the door to the gates open, they get a splinter, something that they can physically feel. Talk about the sound of the sand crunching underneath their boots, the smell of the meats, the smell of sweat. They can taste the sand in their mouth. Use every sense that you can, every single sense that you can use to trigger any sort of physiological response in them brings them one step closer, as close as you can possibly get, to being in their characters' brains, to being in that world. And that is not something that requires a lot of heavy lifting on your end as the dungeon master. It just takes practice. Next time you're describing a scene, next time you're setting up a battle, next time you're doing anything that involves trying to get your players more involved, I highly recommend that you try adding 1 or 2 more senses than you would normally do. I think you'll be pleasantly surprised. Now, let me know in the comments down below what you saw when I described a large castle in the beginning of the video. Let me know in the comments down below. As always, forge on, my friends, and remember, I like pepperoni pizza.